This lecture accompanies Chapter 11 of your textbook, Psychoanalysis After Freud. In this lecture, I'll review how Freud's theory has been reinterpreted and altered by theorists that we refer to as Neo-Freudians. I'll also provide a brief overview of object relations and attachment theories, and touch on important concepts introduced by Jung, Horney, Adler, Erikson, and Winnicott. Finally, I'll say a bit about the aspects of psychoanalytic theory that have been empirically supported. Neo-Freudian psychology is a general term for the psychoanalytically oriented work of many theorists and researchers who are influenced by Freud's theory. These theorists generally reinterpreted the meaning of the libido as a general motivation behind life and creativity rather than being all about sex. These theorists also focused more, at least some of them, on conscious thought rather than just unconscious processes. And they placed less emphasis on instinctual drives and more emphasis on interpersonal relationships. Adler was the first Freud disciple to rebel. He thought that Freud focused too much on sex as the ultimate motivator and organizer of thought and behavior. Instead, he proposed that we are all motivated by the desire to relate positively and productively with other people. One of his key ideas was organ inferiority. This is the idea that individuals are motivated to attain equality with or superiority over other people and try to accomplish this to compensate for what they felt in childhood was their weakest aspect. You're probably more familiar with the term inferiority complex, which also comes out of Adler's work. You can think of the inferiority complex as representing the adult behavior that results from childhood perceptions of inferiority. Carl Jung was a close and early disciple of Freud, but he was more interested in mystical and spiritual matters than Freud could get comfortable with, and the two had a falling out. Jung's best known idea is the collective unconscious. This refers to the memories and ideas that all humans share, most of which reside in the unconscious. Some of these memories and ideas are in the form of basic images that reflect how people think about the world consciously and unconsciously. He called these basic images archetypes and include Earth Mother, the hero, the devil, and the supreme being. I'll refer you to the textbook for more information on these specific archetypes. But in general, they are said to appear in dreams, fantasies, mythology, and modern literature. Another lasting idea of Jung's was the persona. This is his term for the social mask one wears in public. He proposed that everyone is false in public to some degree. We all keep some aspects of our real selves private. The possible danger, according to Jung, is identifying more with the persona than the real self, which leads to being shallow and having social success as one's only life purpose. Another influential concept is the anima and the animus. The anima is the idea or prototype of the female as held in the mind of a male, whereas the animus is the idea or prototype of the male as held in the mind of a female. These two images cause everyone to have some aspects of the opposite sex in their psychological makeup, and they also shape responses to the other sex. This can lead to problems if perceptions are not accurate, according to Jung. Karen Horney is one of the three most influential women in the history of psychoanalytic thought. She disagreed with Freud's theory that all women experience penis envy and a desire to be male. She said if women envy anything about men, it was the freedom to pursue interests and ambitions, and that's due to the structure of society, not women's bodies. Her own theory centered around something she called basic anxiety, which is the fear of being alone and helpless in a hostile world. She believed that all adult behavior is based on efforts to overcome this basic anxiety. However, attempts to avoid the anxiety can cause problems that she referred to as neurotic needs. These are needs that people feel but that are neither realistic nor truly desirable. For example, the inner belief that finding a life partner will solve all of your problems is a neurotic need. These needs can lead to self-defeating behavior and relationship problems because they are contradictory. Erik Erikson called himself a Freudian thinker, but he undertook a massive revision of Freud's theory. He proposed that many psychological conflicts are actually conscious and are salient at specific stages of life across the lifespan, not just in childhood. He was also one of the first psychoanalytic thinkers to talk about the role of society and social structures in the development of personality, and therefore his theory is called the psychosocial theory of development, very different from Freud's psychosexual theory of development. Erikson's stages are worth looking at in some detail. The first 5 stages correspond roughly to Freud's stages. Stage 1, Erikson says, is all about basic trust versus mistrust in the early years of life. And at this stage, the goal is to develop hope, which he defined as a positive but not arrogant attitude toward life, and to gain confidence that basic needs will be met. Stage 2 is autonomy versus shame and doubt, and this corresponds to Freud's anal stage. The crisis over autonomy versus shame and doubt is about figuring out who is in charge, the adult or the child. Stage 3 is known as the initiative versus guilt stage. It corresponds to the phallic stage around 4 to 7 years of age. During this stage, the child develops a sense of right and wrong. According to Erikson, it is the beginning of adult morality. Stage 4 is known as the industry versus inferiority stage and corresponds to Freud's latency period. During this stage, the child must develop skills and abilities to succeed. And in order to do that, the child needs to learn to focus his or her energy in productive ways. Stage 5 is identity versus identity confusion. This is the adolescent stage, and it corresponds to Freud's genital stage, but it's very different from Freud's in that it isn't a stage that is attained, it is just another stage during which a conflict must be negotiated and mastered before moving on to the next stage. Erikson suggested the crisis that needs to be resolved here is around identity and figuring out who one is. Also very different from Freud, Erikson's stages just keep going. He suggested that stage 6 happens in young adulthood, where young adults must master the task of intimacy versus isolation and find an intimate partner. Middle adults must figure out how to best to invest in the next generation and or how to stay productive. This is stage 70. This is stage 7, which Erikson refers to as generativity versus stagnation. So someone who is 50 years old, they are trying to figure out how best to be productive, whether that is investing in the next generation or learning to do new things like painting or taking on new hobbies. Stage 8 is the final stage in his lifespan model, and this is focused on resolving the conflict of integrity versus despair. This stage is brought on by the prospect of death, and it's during this stage that a person must look over their life and find meaning and wisdom. Erikson focused mostly on intrapersonal or within-person processes. Some theorists like Melanie Klein and D.W. Winnicott focus more on the interpersonal aspects of life, particularly how early parent-child relationships affect people's perceptions of themselves and relationships with other people in adulthood. Freud had suggested that our relationships with other people are mediated through our mental images of them, which sometimes don't accurately resemble the way things really are. He referred to these mental images as objects. Klein, Winnicott, and other object relations theorists based their ideas on the importance of objects and how objects impact us interpersonally throughout life. Some of the main premises of object relations theory include the fact that we relate to others via the images that we have of them in our minds, even when those images don't necessarily match. Every relationship has elements of satisfaction and frustration, or pleasure and pain, and personality forms based on how we negotiate those contradictions within relationships and within ourselves. Attachment theory followed closely on the heels of object relations theory. John Bowlby is best known for developing this theory along with Mary Ainsworth. Attachment theory is like object relations theory with an evolutionary psychology lens. Bowlby reasoned that early parent-child attachments were critical because humans evolved in a risky environment and required close connection to one another to maintain safety. The importance of these relationships, however, doesn't stop after we stop being children. These early relationship patterns get ingrained and end up affecting all of our relationships throughout life. There are two key constructs that you need to be aware of when talking about attachment theory and the research on attachment theory. First is the fact that attachments are based on internal working models. These are mental representations or schema for how we view ourselves, whether we're worthy of love and protection. These representations are similar to the objects we just talked about, and they also play out throughout our lifetimes. However, it's very difficult to assess internal working models. The best way to assess the type of relationship that a child and parent have with one another is to have them participate in the strange situation. This is a lab-based paradigm that involves child separating from the mother in order to assess their attachment relationship. The theory goes like this, that a primary caregiver's behavior towards the child will influence the child's internal working model of itself. So depending on how the caregiver behaves toward the child will feel either positive and loved, unloved and rejected, or angry and confused. And then these three different types of internal working models will give rise to behaviors in the attachment relationship that can be categorized as either secure, avoidant, or resistant. Let's take a look at each of these. So anxious ambivalent attachment is when the child is vigilant about the mother's presence and becomes upset when the mother leaves. These caregivers are generally inconsistent, and that is what is causing the vigilance in the child's behavior. In adulthood, children who were anxious and ambivalent attempt to cling to others so much that it drives them away. They are more likely to be more obsessed with romantic partners and to frequently worry that the partners don't really love them. There are also higher rates of extreme jealousy and relationship failure. Avoidant attachment can result when caregivers rebuff attempts for contact and reassurance during childhood. A child that has an avoidant attachment with their primary caregiver is not distressed when the mother leaves during the strange situation, but there might be physiological signs of tension and anxiety. The child also ignores the mother when she comes back after being separated from the child. Adults who were avoidant as children can behave as angry and self-reliant and cold. There's often a distant attitude toward others and feeling uncomfortable about being close to others. There's a difficulty in trusting others completely, and many who experience avoidant attachments are just generally uninterested in romantic relationships altogether. The final attachment style is secure. A secure attachment results when a child feels loved and they feel confident that the primary caregiver will be there for them when they need them. Caregivers who are able to soothe children and are emotionally available to the child can help promote a secure attachment relationship. Adult characteristics of people who had a secure attachment in childhood include a positive attitude toward relationships, finding it easy to get close to others and to depend on them, and to generally be open to long and stable relationships and seeking out others for emotional support when under stress. It's important to note that all of these attachment relationships that I have discussed refer to a specific relationship with a primary caregiver in childhood. There is a theory that we all develop different types of attachments throughout life with multiple people. Luckily, attachments can be changed. Just because there was a particular type of attachment that you experienced with a primary caregiver when you were a young child, that doesn't mean you're destined to repeat that relationship with every single person. However, it does mean that there may be certain biases or ways in which you approach relationships with other others based on that early experience. I'm going to sum up here with 5 of the Neo-Freudian propositions that have actually been established and supported by the research. One is that much of mental life is unconscious. We now know this. Research shows that a tremendous amount of information processing occurs at the neural level without us knowing it, and that our minds are doing many things at once and can often be in conflict with itself. There's very clear evidence that events in childhood profoundly shape adult personality. We know that relationships formed with significant other people establish patterns that can be repeated throughout life. And we also know now that psychological development does involve moving from a more unregulated, immature, self-centered state to a more regulated, mature state, which is consistent with all of the Neo-Freudians and their theories.